Picture this. You stand in the crisp autumn air of ancient Greece, raising your hand not in prayer to the gods, but to sign a death warrant for thousands of your own neighbours. The world remembers you as a crimson-caped hero, the ultimate defender of freedom against impossible odds. But your very first official act as an elected Spartan leader is to declare a brutal legal war on the very people who grow your food and wash your clothes. This chilling annual ritual absolves your citizens from the religious guilt of murder, transforming elite warriors into state-sponsored serial killers hunting in the dark. This is the dark side of Sparta that history books and blockbuster movies conveniently erase, the ancient Greek atrocities hidden in plain sight within the ancient texts of Plutarch. Why would the most unstoppable military machine on Earth need to terrorize unarmed farmers in the dead of night just to survive? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Let us rip away the Hollywood filters and step onto the bloody soil of the Eurotas Valley in the 5th century BC. When you dig into real ancient Sparta history, you uncover a society built entirely on a razor's edge. Men here did not farm, they did not build ships, they did not trade. From the moment they could walk, they were trained strictly to kill. But to sustain an entire civilization solely dedicated to combat, someone else had to do the bleeding in the fields. Enter the Helots. These were not foreign captives bought and sold in a bustling Athenian market. They were an entire conquered nation of neighbouring Messenians, crushed into servitude, chained to the very land their ancestors once ruled, and owned entirely by the Spartan state. Here is the terrifying mathematical reality that haunted every Spartan commander. The Helots outnumbered their elite masters by an overwhelming ratio of 7-1. Every single day was a ticking time bomb. Imagine living in a permanent military camp, clutching your spear even while you sleep, surrounded by a massive enslaved population desperate to slit your throat. The Spartan warrior myths of ultimate bravery and unbreakable shield walls were not just born from a desire for glory. They were forged from a suffocating paranoid need for self-preservation. To stop a massive uprising before it could even spark, Sparta realized that military might on the battlefield was not enough. They had to architect a system of psychological warfare and institutionalized terror so extreme it would break the human spirit for generations to come. Let us dismantle the grand illusions that pop culture has fed us for decades. When you picture the legendary Battle of Thermopylae, you likely imagine 300 invincible heroes standing completely alone against 1 million Persian invaders. This image is the absolute cornerstone of all Spartan warrior myths, but history conveniently leaves out a crucial detail that changes the entire narrative. Those 300 elite fighters did not march to the hot gates by themselves. They were accompanied by an estimated 900, perhaps even thousands, of light-armed troops and baggage carriers. And who were these invisible shadows carrying the heavy bronze shields, pitching the tents, and preparing the meals while the masters prepared to die in glory? They were the Spartan slaves, the Helots, dragged onto a foreign battlefield to serve the very men who ruthlessly oppressed them back home. To understand this bizarre and twisted dynamic, we must look at the strict foundation of their society. According to the ancient codes laid down by the mythical lawgiver Lycurgus, a true Spartan citizen, known as a Spartiate, was legally forbidden from engaging in any form of trade, commerce, or manual labour. Imagine a civilization where the entire ruling class is strictly banned from making money through everyday work. Their sole profession, their only permitted purpose from the cradle to the grave, was war. But spears snap in battle, shields dent, stomachs rumble, and children need to be fed. If the elite citizens are constantly marching in the barracks or practicing shield formations, who is harvesting the wheat in the blistering summer heat? The stark reality of ancient Sparta history is that their glorious utopia was effectively a massive parasite, feeding entirely on the forced labour of the conquered Messenians. Here lies the grand, tragic paradox of their culture. The Spartans were fiercely proud of their liberty. They famously taunted empires, claiming they would rather bleed into the dirt than bow to a foreign king. Yet their celebrated freedom was completely dependent on the absolute, crushing subjugation of others. They achieved the ultimate leisure class, not to paint beautiful masterpieces or debate philosophy like their rivals in Athens, but to endure grueling physical punishment in the dust. They created a flawless military machine, but its primary function was not just to conquer new lands across the sea. Its most vital, exhausting, and paranoid task was to keep their own workforce pinned down. The masters were terrified of their servants, and the servants despised their masters with a burning generational hatred. This simmering cauldron of resentment meant that violence was not just an occasional tool for discipline. It was the fundamental glue holding the state together. The Spartans knew deeply that to prevent a catastrophic Helot rebellion, physical chains were never going to be enough. They had to systematically crush the dignity of these people, ensuring the servants never even remembered what it felt like to be human. Imagine being born into a world where your very existence is considered a permanent threat to the state. For the Helots, life was not merely a matter of exhausting physical labour in the sun-baked fields of the Eurotas Valley. It was a carefully orchestrated nightmare of psychological destruction. The Spartan masters understood a fundamental, terrifying truth about human nature. A man who retains even a shred of his dignity will eventually find the courage to fight back. To prevent the constant, suffocating fear of a Helot rebellion from becoming a bloody reality, the ruling class devised methods of public humiliation so profound that they actively stripped away the concept of humanity from their captives. You were not just a servant, you were a living, breathing object lesson in inferiority. Let us step inside one of the famous Spartan mess halls, the Syssitia, where the elite warriors gathered daily to eat their infamous black broth and bond as an unbreakable military unit. If you were a young Spartan boy observing your elders, your education in supremacy did not just come from holding a heavy wooden shield. It came directly from watching the brutal treatment of the Spartan slaves. The masters would deliberately drag a Helot from the fields into the centre of the dining hall and force him to consume massive quantities of unmixed, dangerously potent wine. As the alcohol took hold and the captive lost control of his limbs, stumbling and collapsing onto the hard stone floor, the Spartans would force him to perform grotesque, humiliating dances and sing ridiculous, degrading songs. This spectacle was not simply cruel entertainment for bored soldiers. It was a highly calculated, state-sponsored curriculum. The fathers would point to the wretched, trembling figure covered in filth and tell their sons that this is what happens when a man lacks discipline. They would say, "Look at this creature. This is a Helot." By staging these horrific displays of physical and mental degradation, the Spartans achieved two terrifying goals simultaneously. First, they deeply traumatized the servant population, reinforcing the violent lie that they were naturally inferior, pathetic, and fundamentally unworthy of freedom. If a society constantly treats you like an animal, generation after generation, the state hopes you will eventually surrender and believe you are one. Second, and perhaps far more dangerously, they completely desensitized their own children to the suffering of others. When a young Spartan looked at a Helot, he was meticulously trained not to see a fellow human being with a family, hopes, or a soul. He saw a subhuman beast of burden, an object of pure disgust and mockery. This psychological conditioning was absolutely vital for the survival of their culture. You see, it is psychologically difficult for a normal human being to murder another in cold blood. But if you have been forcefully taught since you were a child that the person standing in front of you is nothing more than a dangerous pest, taking their life becomes as easy as breathing. This systemic dehumanization laid the perfect bloody groundwork for the true horrors that awaited these Spartan boys when they finally came of age. At the age of 7, a Spartan boy's childhood abruptly ends. He's torn from his mother's arms and thrust directly into the Agoge training, arguably the most brutal educational system ever devised in human existence. Forget the modern concept of school, or even a rigorous military academy. This was a massive state-run psychological factory designed to mass-produce absolute obedience, extreme physical endurance, and a profound capacity for violence. But building muscular bodies capable of holding a heavy bronze shield in a phalanx formation was only half of the curriculum. The true, terrifying objective of this legendary program was to systematically murder a child's capacity for empathy. How do you create a soldier who will unflinchingly slaughter his own helpless servants without a second thought? You start by making him desperate. The instructors of the Agoge deliberately underfed these growing children, providing them with just enough meagre rations to keep them breathing, but leaving them constantly, agonizingly hungry. This was not a flaw in the Spartan supply chain. It was a highly calculated pedagogical tool. Driven by the sharp pain of starvation, the boys were actively encouraged by their masters to sneak out of the barracks into the night and steal food. And where do you think they stole this food from? They crept into the farms, storehouses, and humble dwellings of the Helots. If a boy successfully stole a wheel of cheese or a stolen goat and returned to the barracks undetected, he was highly praised by his elders for his stealth, resourcefulness, and cunning. But if he was caught in the act, the physical punishment was swift, public, and incredibly severe. Here is the twisted genius of their system. The boy was not brutally whipped for the moral crime of theft. He was beaten mercilessly simply because he was clumsy and careless enough to get caught. This reversed moral framework taught the youth of ancient Sparta history a chilling lesson. It ingrained in them the idea that the property, the dignity, and ultimately the lives of the enslaved population were completely unprotected by any moral code or law. They were merely resources to be exploited, obstacles to be overcome, or targets to be practiced upon. The state was essentially training its children to view the subjugated class as their own personal hunting ground. Imagine the profound psychological toll of this existence. You're a starving 12-year-old creeping through the pitch-black darkness, a jagged rock or a small blade in your hand, entirely prepared to crack the skull of an exhausted Helot farmer just to get a handful of grain to survive the week. You learn very quickly that survival means entirely suppressing your humanity and embracing cold cruelty. The Spartan warrior myths that constantly celebrate their unmatched discipline and heroism often completely ignore this fundamental, uncomfortable truth. Their legendary toughness was forged by intentionally turning children into feral, calculating predators. By the time these boys reached their late teens, the Agoge had successfully burned away their compassion, leaving behind hardened weapons of the state, and they were now perfectly primed for the final bloodiest phase of their education. For the vast majority of young men, surviving the grueling, violent decades of the Agoge meant finally taking their rightful place in the legendary Spartan phalanx. But for a select, terrifying few, the absolute most ruthless, cunning, and physically gifted graduates of this bloody academy, a much darker honour awaited. They were quietly pulled aside by the state magistrates and initiated into a shadow organisation that strikes fear into the hearts of historians even today. Enter the Spartan Crypteia. Often translated as the secret police or the hidden ones, this elite unit was not designed to gather military intelligence on foreign empires like Persia or Athens. Their battlefield was entirely domestic, and their designated enemy was the very workforce that kept their entire civilization alive. The ancient historian Plutarch provides a bone-chilling description of their mandate. Armed with absolutely nothing but a short iron dagger and the bare minimum of basic rations, these elite young killers were sent out into the rugged countryside of Laconia and Messenia. Their orders were simple yet devastatingly brutal. During the daylight hours, they were commanded to scatter into obscure hiding places, concealing themselves in thick brush, deep ravines, or the dense forests overlooking the agricultural estates. They had to remain completely invisible, watching the fields in dead silence as the Helots toiled under the blistering sun. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and pitch-black darkness blanketed the Eurotas Valley, the true nightmare began. The members of the Spartan Crypteia emerged from the shadows to execute their state-sponsored mission of terror. They stalked the dirt roads and the quiet farming villages, actively hunting down any Helot they encountered wandering the night. But this was not just mindless, random slaughter. It was a highly calculated, systematic culling of the subjugated population. The secret police specifically targeted the strongest, the most intelligent, and the most physically fit among the enslaved men. If a Helot showed too much pride, possessed an unusually muscular physique from his hard labour, or demonstrated any natural leadership qualities among his peers, he was immediately marked for death. The Spartans understood a fundamental paranoid law of oppression. A massive flock cannot organise a stampede if you constantly slaughter the strongest rams. By systematically assassinating the best and the brightest of the servant class, the state effectively decapitated any potential rebellion before a single plot could even be whispered in the dark. Imagine the psychological suffocation of being a captive father in this system. You work yourself to the bone all day to feed your masters, but you must constantly shrink your posture, hide your strength, dull your eyes, and swallow your pride. Because simply standing out as a capable, strong human being was a guaranteed death sentence. For the young Spartan assassins, shedding this innocent blood was their final, twisted graduation test. proving they were perfectly willing to commit atrocities to maintain the absolute dominance of their state. Put yourself in the cold dirt of the Peloponnese, hidden deep within a thicket of olive trees. The sun has vanished, and the only light comes from the pale moon casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. You're an 18-year-old initiate, hand-picked for the secret police of Sparta. For days, you've been surviving on nothing but river water and handfuls of stolen grain, waiting for this exact moment. Your body aches from the punishing Agoge training, but your mind is razor-sharp. You're not here to fight an armoured Persian immortal or an Athenian hoplite. Your target tonight is a man whose only crime was being born with broad shoulders and a steady, defiant gaze that the magistrates deemed too dangerous to let live. As the crickets chirp in the stifling silence, you hear the faint crunch of dried leaves. A figure emerges on the dirt path. It is a Helot, exhausted from a grueling 16-hour day harvesting wheat for a Spartan master. He's carrying a small bundle of firewood back to his family. His muscles ripple under the moonlight, a physical testament to a lifetime of forced labour. In any other society, his strength would be a crucial asset, a pillar for his community. Here, in the paranoid machinery of the Spartan state, it is a glaring beacon for assassination. The leaders know that if a massive Helot rebellion were ever to ignite, strong, capable men like him would be the ones leading the charge. You tighten your grip on your iron dagger. Your instructors have conditioned you for this exact second. They have taught you that this man is not a father, not a husband, and certainly not a human being. He is merely a threat that needs to be culled to keep the entire system from collapsing. As he passes your hiding spot, you do not challenge him to a fair duel. There is no glorious clash of bronze shields or honourable combat that the ancient warrior myths constantly praise. You simply step out from the shadows and strike, a quick, brutal thrust in the dark. As the heavy bundle of wood clatters to the dusty ground, the man collapses, gasping for air he will never catch. You watch the life leave his eyes, but you feel no remorse, no guilt. The state has meticulously removed your conscience. You wipe your blade on the grass and melt back into the silent darkness, ready to hunt again. This was the terrifying daily reality inside the secret police of Sparta. It was an institution built entirely on cowardly nocturnal murder, designed to break the spirit of an entire captive nation and ensure the elite citizens could sleep soundly in their beds. But a society constructed on a foundation of constant murder is a society waiting for an explosion, and soon the earth itself would shatter their fragile illusion of control. For centuries, the Spartan state had compressed their captive population like a tightly coiled spring. Through public humiliation, systemic starvation, and the nightly terror of the secret police, they truly believed they had completely broken the spirit of an entire conquered nation. But human desperation is a highly volatile force, and in the year 464 BC, the Earth itself decided to intervene. Without warning, a catastrophic earthquake violently struck the Peloponnese, shaking the Eurotas Valley and completely tearing the unfortified city of Sparta apart. Entire buildings collapsed into choking dust. The training gymnasiums were crushed, and a massive portion of the elite Spartan warrior class was instantly buried under tons of heavy rubble. In the terrifying, chaotic aftermath of the destruction, as the dust slowly settled over the ruined city, the subjugated masses looked upon the devastation. They did not see a tragic natural disaster to mourn. They saw a divine, golden opportunity. The invincible masters were bleeding. Their numbers were decimated, their barracks destroyed, and their iron grip was suddenly shattered. Word spread through the fields and the surviving agricultural estates like wildfire. The men who had spent their entire lives bowing their heads, hiding their physical strength, and weeping in silence for their murdered sons finally picked up whatever weapons they could find. Heavy farming scythes, crude tools, and stolen bronze spears were raised into the air. This was the vital spark that ignited the largest and most terrifying Helot rebellion in ancient history. In a matter of days, the arrogant hunters suddenly became the desperate hunted. The 7-to-1 population ratio, the silent nightmare that had fueled Spartan paranoia for generations, was now a catastrophic, violent reality charging towards them. Thousands of enraged Messenians marched furiously on the ruins of Sparta, fully intent on wiping their brutal oppressors off the face of the earth once and for all. The surviving Spartans were forced to quickly organize a frantic defense, fighting in the rubble not for eternal glory or foreign territory, but for their very right to exist. The sheer, unyielding ferocity of this Helot rebellion shocked the entire Greek world. The uprising was so massive and deeply sustained that the furious rebels eventually fortified themselves on Mount Ithome, creating an impenetrable rebel stronghold right in the beating heart of Spartan territory. The supposedly invincible Lacedaemonian army, the absolute masters of open-field combat, found themselves completely bogged down in a humiliating decade-long siege against the very people who used to wash their clothes. They were pushed to such an absolute breaking point that they even had to swallow their immense pride and beg their bitter rivals, the Athenians, for military assistance to help crush the uprising. This violent rupture in history proved a profound point. No matter how many brutal laws you pass, no matter how many secret police you deploy in the dead of night, you can never permanently extinguish the human desire for freedom. The dust of the Great Rebellion eventually settled, and the surviving rebels of Mount Ithome were remarkably allowed to leave the Peloponnese alive in a negotiated truce. But for the elite citizens who remained behind in the rebuilt city, the psychological damage was permanent and absolutely devastating. They had stared directly into the eyes of their own annihilation, and the sheer terror of that experience forever altered the course of ancient Sparta history. This brings us to the ultimate tragic irony of their entire civilization. When we look back at the Lacedaemonians, we see the absolute masters of the Greek world, the untouchable elites who proudly bent everyone to their iron will. But if you look closely at their daily lives after the earthquake, you have to ask a very profound question. Who were the real prisoners in this society? The Spartans were entirely trapped in a maximum security prison of their own meticulous design. The paranoia was so deeply woven into their culture that it dictated the most mundane aspects of their existence. Consider this fascinating and highly revealing historical detail. When a Spartan warrior finally returned to his own home to rest, he did not simply place his weapons in a corner and relax with his family. He systematically dismantled his primary weapon, physically separating the sharp iron spearhead from the long wooden shaft, before storing them in completely different locations within the house. Why would the most highly trained killer on Earth need to hide his own weapons inside his own home? Because he was absolutely terrified that a Helot servant, quietly sweeping the floors or preparing a meal, might suddenly grab the fully assembled spear and stab him in the back while he slept. The masters could never truly close their eyes. A Spartiate citizen was practically required to carry a weapon at all times, even when walking the short, familiar distance between his front door and the communal dining hall. They lived in a constant, suffocating state of hypervigilance. They had successfully built an unmatched military machine, but they had completely sacrificed their peace of mind, their artistic development, and their very humanity to maintain it. Their legendary discipline was not just a proud expression of martial virtue. It was a desperate, exhausting coping mechanism for extreme institutional anxiety. The oppressed Helots were physically bound by chains and the relentless nightly threat of the secret police, but the masters were psychologically chained to the Helots. They were eternally handcuffed to the very people they violently abused, locked in a toxic, deadly embrace that continuously drained their resources and completely stunted the growth of their civilization. The terrifying truth of their society is that when you build an entire empire on the back of immense human suffering and systematic terror, you never truly get to enjoy the spoils of your power. You just spend the rest of your life desperately guarding the doors. The paranoid machinery of the Lacedaemonian state was incredibly effective at maintaining internal terror, but it carried a fatal mathematical flaw. You cannot build a sustainable empire when your primary focus is constantly looking over your own shoulder. As the decades bled into centuries, ancient Sparta history reveals a slow, agonizing demographic collapse known as oliganthropia, a severe and terrifying shortage of Spartan citizens. The relentless cycle of warfare, combined with the incredibly strict requirements to maintain full citizenship, caused the elite population to absolutely plummet. They were bleeding out, not just on foreign battlefields, but from their own rigid, unforgiving social structure. By the early 4th century BC, the unstoppable Spartan military machine was running entirely on fumes. They simply did not have enough Spartiate warriors left to suppress the massive enslaved population and simultaneously project power across the Greek world. And then, the inevitable breaking point arrived. In the year 371 BC, on the dusty plains of Leuctra, the Spartan army faced the rising power of Thebes, led by a brilliant tactician named Epaminondas. For the first time in centuries, the legendary Spartan phalanx was utterly shattered in open combat. The invincible aura of the crimson-caped warriors evaporated in a single bloody afternoon. But the true death blow to the Spartan state did not happen on the battlefield of Leuctra. It happened in the brilliant aftermath. Recognizing exactly where Sparta's true vulnerability lay, the victorious Theban general did not just march on their city to burn it to the ground. He executed a masterful stroke of psychological and economic warfare. Epaminondas marched his army directly into the Peloponnese, bypassed the ruined Spartan forces, and entered the conquered territory of Messenia. With a single earth-shattering decree, he liberated the Messenian Helots. He helped them build a massive, heavily fortified new capital city called Messene, right on Sparta's doorstep. Overnight, the Spartan slaves, the very people who had endured centuries of the Agoge training's brutal practical exams, the survivors who had hidden from the secret police of Sparta, were suddenly free. They were no longer the hunted prey. They were heavily armed, independent citizens staring down their former masters from behind impenetrable stone walls. Without the forced labour of the Helots to harvest their crops, the entire Spartan economy collapsed instantly. The elite warriors, who had spent their entire existence perfecting the art of killing, suddenly found themselves with no one to feed them. The great Spartan civilization did not slowly fade into the sunset with honour. It starved to death, entirely crippled by the sudden removal of the very foundation of human suffering it had built its entire identity upon. As we look back at the dark side of Sparta, we are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about human civilization. The Lacedaemonians achieved what many modern societies still secretly crave: absolute order, unmatched military discipline, and a citizenry entirely devoted to the state. But the agonizing price they paid for this heavily armed utopia was their own humanity. They built a society so completely obsessed with controlling the bodies and minds of others that they forgot how to build anything that would actually outlast their own paranoid existence. Today, if you visit the geographic heart of ancient Sparta history, you will not find the breathtaking marble columns of a Parthenon or the grand amphitheatres that define the cultural legacy of Athens. You will find dust, a few scattered stones, and the lingering ghosts of a brutalized people. The Spartan warrior myths that we eagerly consume in modern theatres and graphic novels are, in reality, nothing more than the beautifully crafted propaganda of a failed, parasitic state. The terrifying tale of the Spartan Crypteia hunting innocent farmers in the dead of night, the calculated cruelty of the Agoge training, and the explosive, earth-shattering vengeance of the Great Helot Rebellion are not just obscure footnotes in a dusty textbook. They serve as a timeless, urgent warning for the modern world. Any system of power, no matter how physically imposing or heavily armed, that relies on the systemic degradation, starvation, and slaughter of its most vulnerable people, is inherently doomed to fail. It will inevitably rot from the inside out, utterly consumed by the very terror it actively uses to maintain its grip on control. The true, enduring tragedy of the Spartans is not that they were eventually defeated in battle by superior tactics, but that they willingly traded their capacity for art, philosophy, empathy, and genuine human progress for the exhausting, soul-crushing privilege of becoming the most heavily armed prison guards in the ancient world. Meanwhile, the descendants of the Spartan slaves they tortured for centuries went on to build Messene, a massive, thriving city that outlasted the power of their former masters. History has a profound way of balancing the scales of justice, even if it takes centuries to do so. So the next time you see a movie glorifying the invincible 300 standing at the hot gates, look past the bronze shields and the crimson capes. Ask yourself, who is standing in the shadows behind them, and what terrible bloody price was paid for their glorious illusion. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the hidden corners of our past. If this video changed the way you look at history, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. What historical myths should we expose next? Drop your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.